Our story starts with our protagonist, a young guy named Kazuya Soma. He's sitting, listening to a reflection from his grandfather, who tells him that we all need a family so we don't die alone. He also advises Kazuya that once he's gone, Kazuya should find his own family and live a happy life. He mentions that Kazuya should always protect them, and when the time comes for his life to end, he'll know that he had a good life. These words stuck with Kazuya because they were like his grandfather's last wish. A few days later, his grandfather passed away, leaving Kazuya alone with no family. His parents, grandparents, and even any siblings were all gone. Meanwhile, in another world, the king and his advisors are trying to come up with a solution for the kingdom's problem. They decide that their best option is to summon a hero from another world. They know it's risky, but they have no other choice. The king agrees and starts the summoning ritual with the help of some mages. The entire castle is filled with light as the magic expands into the sky, creating the summoning seal. Our protagonist, Kazuya, is in a library at the time, putting some books back on the shelf when a blue symbol appears under his feet. Before he knows it, he's transported to another place, falling from the sky and landing in front of the people who summoned him. Kazuya is freaked out, not understanding what's happening. The priest who performed the ritual is equally shocked. They didn't actually expect the spell to work. Later on, after getting changed, Kazuya enters the king's hall, where King Albert thanks him for accepting their request to come to this place. But Kazuya responds that he didn't agree to anything. He was brought here without any warning. The king apologizes, explaining that he didn't know about the summoning beforehand and apologizes for the inconvenience. Kazuya then asks them to explain why they summoned him before he decides whether to be upset or not. The king explains that they live on a large continent populated by various races, including humans, elves, dwarves, and even dragons. These races have formed different countries across the continent, but 10 years ago, a cloud of demonic magic appeared in the north, from which hordes of demons began emerging, causing widespread destruction in the northern countries. Seeing this, the other countries banded together to form an army to stop the demons, but they were defeated. The demon army grew stronger and took control of a third of the continent, now called the Demon Lord's domain. The other countries managed to stop the demon army's advance, but in return, they have to send financial aid to keep the fight going. The king further explains that the Grand Chaos Empire, a powerful nation leading the charge against the demons, requested financial aid from their kingdom. However, instead of sending money, they sent Kazuya as part of a deal. Kazuya, hearing this, is in disbelief. They go on to explain that the Grand Chaos Empire is doing the heavy lifting in the demon war, and their kingdom has benefited from this. However, they can't afford to send money or food due to a severe economic crisis. Instead, they invoked an old pact, summoning a hero, which was part of their alliance with the Empire. Kazuya is understandably upset about being treated like a bargaining chip. He realizes that once he's sent to the other kingdom, he could be killed or experimented on for being from another world. He considers running away but knows it's nearly impossible in this new world. Kazuya then asks how easy it is to summon heroes from other worlds. The king explains that the last and only time it happened was 500 years ago. Realizing his limited options, Kazuya offers an alternative. Instead of sending him right away, he proposes that he helps them improve their economy and save the nation. That way, they won't need to keep relying on other kingdoms. The king and his advisors decide to give it a shot, putting Kazuya in charge of fixing their finances. Though he motivated the king with his words, Kazuya himself has no idea how to improve the kingdom, but he figures that if he can just help them get more money, he can avoid being sent off to war. He asks the king for all the information about the kingdom, its infrastructure, economy, agriculture, everything. He spends 3 days studying alongside the kingdom's minister. After 3 exhausting days, Kazuya is worn out. Meanwhile, King Albert makes a shocking announcement. He's stepping down from the throne and naming Kazuya the new king. He also announces that Kazuya is now engaged to his daughter, Licia. This surprises everyone, especially Kazuya. As the news spreads to other kingdoms, no one can understand why the king would hand over the kingdom to a hero. Licia, who had been away in another kingdom, rushes back home upon hearing the news, fearing this might be part of some plot against the king. When she confronts her father, he explains that he made the decision because he believes Kazuya is more capable of ruling the kingdom than he is. Licia, however, demands an explanation for being engaged without her consent. Albert reassures her that if Kazuya doesn't want to marry her, the engagement can be called off, and he suggests she gets to know the hero first. Licia, still upset, goes to meet Kazuya. When she enters the hall, she finds him buried in stacks of documents, fully immersed in his work. Without looking at her, Kazuya asks if she can read and then quizzes her with some math problems. Surprised by his education, Licia responds correctly. Impressed, Kazuya invites her to stay and help him with his work, as a fresh mind could be useful. Licia then introduces herself as the daughter of King Albert, but Kazuya doesn't believe her at first since she's wearing a military uniform. She explains that she's part of the special forces led by Duke Carmine and came back as soon as she heard the news. Kazuya clarifies that he didn't steal anything from her father, the king basically threw the throne at him. Licia then asks how he went from being a hero to becoming the new king. Kazuya admits he doesn't understand it himself. He only wanted to save his life and avoid going to war. He explains some of the reforms he's working on to improve the economy, though he didn't expect to be handed the throne. Licia apologizes for her initial behavior, but Kazuya reassures her, saying she was the most dedicated one. He promises that once he stabilizes the kingdom's finances, he'll step down and let her take over, as he has no desire to stay on the throne. He also offers to break off the engagement. Licia, intrigued, asks about the money they owe the Grand Chaos Empire. Kazuya confidently replies that he's got it covered. He sold off most of the kingdom's national treasure, including jewels, to a neighboring empire, raising a lot of money. Licia is shocked, pointing out that those treasures included valuable historical artifacts. Kazuya explains that he set aside the most historically significant items for a future museum, only selling off things with less cultural value. He also stored some strange magical items and weapons to prevent anyone from misusing their power. Meanwhile, in another part of the kingdom, a woman orders her servant to spy on the new king, curious to see how he'll handle ruling the kingdom and whether he's capable of maintaining order. On the other hand, we go back to Licia, who is amazed by the decisions Kazuya has been making. She suggests that instead of sending the money elsewhere, they should invest it in the military, strengthening their power so they won't have to keep following orders from the other empire. But Kazuya refuses. He explains that they need to buy time and improve their economy because if their kingdom falls into famine, a rebellion is almost certain. After a few days, Kazuya realizes that life in this world is completely different from his own. Here, people fly on dragons, ships are powered by sea dragons, and magic is used for things like lighting and even cooking fires. Despite all of this, their technology is still stuck at a medieval level. His task as the new king is to modernize the kingdom and help it advance in every necessary aspect. While he's thinking about this, one of the priests arrives to take him to undergo a magic test. There's a chance that, since he's from another world, he may have special powers. Kazuya is intrigued and follows the priest to a small statue. The priest explains that by touching it, the statue will reveal the nature of his powers. When Kazuya touches it, everything goes black, and he sees countless colored lights surrounding him, confirming that he does have magic, although the exact type is still unclear. Later on, Kazuya discovers what it is. While working, Licia comes in and asks what he's doing. Kazuya explains that he found out he can transfer his consciousness into objects and control them, so he can have quills write down his thoughts as if they have their own mind. Licia tells him it's a strange power, and Kazuya agrees. However, at the moment, he can only control 3 objects at a time, which has helped him speed up writing reports and reform plans. Licia also mentions that he has plenty of workers doing a lot for him already, but Kazuya explains that he's looking for new sources of income. He's also overseeing those making money from businesses but not paying enough taxes or evading them altogether, warning that if they're caught, they'll be charged with theft and have to pay up or face prison. Hearing all of this, Licia is impressed by Kazuya's commitment to the kingdom's finances and governance. Meanwhile, King Albert wonders how his daughter is doing with Kazuya. After this, Kazuya also assigns Licia to help with paperwork, and after working all night, when morning comes, Kazuya notices everyone else has fallen asleep. He gets up and approaches Licia, touching her hair as she sleeps. She wakes up and, seeing him so close, gets nervous and asks what he's doing. Kazuya tries to explain, saying she looked comfortable, and then asks her to accompany him because he wants to show her something. Later, they go out horseback riding. Kazuya clings tightly to her, explaining that it's his first time on a horse since they don't use them in his world. Licia thinks about this and asks if he has any family or someone special, like a girlfriend or a wife. Kanzuya tells her that his closest family members were his grandparents, who passed away long ago, so there's no one waiting for him in his world. Licia seems pleased to hear this, as she's starting to develop feelings for him. After the ride, they arrive at a cotton field. Licia comments on the beautiful scenery, but Kanzuya explains that one of the reasons for the kingdom's food shortage is the focus on non-edible crops like cotton. Cotton was primarily produced in the northern regions, but with the demon invasion, demand skyrocketed, leading the kingdom to produce much more cotton, which in turn reduced the amount of food being grown. The problem is that cotton's value plummeted when other kingdoms started producing it too, leaving their kingdom with too much cotton and not enough food, which has mostly affected the poorer classes. Licia, frustrated with herself for not noticing this problem, calls herself a failure. But Kanzuya reassures her that learning is part of the process, and this is why he brought her here. He wants her to understand these issues so that when he steps down, he can trust that she'll lead the kingdom with confidence. Later, Kanzuya explains how they'll deal with the situation. They'll limit the cultivation of cotton and other non-edible crops and incentivize farmers with subsidies to grow food like potatoes and wheat. The kingdom will then buy the food at a stable price and sell it to the people at a lower price. This will create some debt, but it'll motivate food production, which is vital. Licia agrees with the plan but doesn't understand why they're eating with the soldiers. Kanzuya explains that they're cutting costs on food to avoid waste, unlike how kings usually dine lavishly. At that moment, they're interrupted by Ludwin, the captain of the royal guard, who comments on how much the guards have been talking about Kanzuya's work as king. Kanzuya responds by saying that if he has time to chat, he could probably work harder. They continue eating together, and Ludwin asks about the progress of the reforms. Kanzuya admits that things aren't going as well as he'd hoped, as only the Prime Minister has been a great help on the important matters. He needs more staff who are willing to work on whatever's required and who understand what's needed in each area. Later that afternoon, Kanzuya talks to Licia about using a transmission gem to broadcast a message across the kingdom to find talented individuals for the tasks at hand. Licia agrees, though this would be the first time it's been used for something like that, as transmission gems are typically reserved for important decrees. Kanzuya asks about literacy rates, and Licia informs him that 50% of the population can't read, and only 30% can write. Frustrated by the fact that 70% of the people wouldn't even be able to take a written exam, Kanzuya vows to improve education once the economy stabilizes. But for now, they need to focus on recruiting capable people. Drawing inspiration from an ancient leader of the Han dynasty who is obsessed with finding talented individuals, Kanzuya broadcasts a message across the kingdom, explaining the crisis they're facing due to the food shortage and the ongoing war with the demon army. He also announces that King Albert stepped down because he felt he wasn't fit to lead anymore and entrusted the kingdom's future to new hands. Kanzuya tells the people that he needs talented individuals to help with the reforms, and that if they believe they're the best at something, they should come forward, regardless of their age, race, or social status. What matters is that they're confident in their skills and can't be surpassed by anyone else. He assures them that even if they think their talent might not be useful to the kingdom, he'll be the one to decide that when he meets them. To wrap up the speech, Kanzuya promises the kingdom that if they prove to him that they're the best at what they do and that no one can surpass them, he'll personally certify them as unmatched in their field. The people are energized by his words, filled with excitement and hope, as individuals from various races and ages feel empowered to be part of the change their new king is bringing. After the announcement, people from various races and ages were motivated to join the cause. Some left important positions, others overcame their insecurities, and a few even left their homes, filled with hope that they could be part of this new change, helping their king and proving they were the best. A few days passed, and Kanzuya realized that in this world, they all spoke a single language. Even though it wasn't Japanese, as a hero, he had the ability to understand and speak it fluently. The same applied to writing. He would think in Japanese, but it would automatically translate into the local language. However, since only Kanzuya understood his native language, if he played an audio file on his phone, people would just hear strange noises. The next morning, Licia wakes up, reflecting on what Kanzuya had told her in the cotton fields. She wonders if she's the right person to lead the kingdom and if she could become his family. She knows Kanzuya doesn't have any family, and she contemplates whether she could be the reason he stays in this world. Just then, her maid walks in, noticing Licia's flustered state and asks if everything is okay. She also reminds her that today is the presentation for the top candidates selected through the tests to find the best talents. Later, they meet with the 5 top candidates who present themselves to Kazuya. 4 of them bow before him, but one does not. The guards demand that she bow, but she explains that in her tribe, they don't bow to anyone except their master, and she asks for understanding. Kazuya tells the guards it's fine and asks them not to be too harsh, as these people are here to help. Next, the Prime Minister introduces each candidate and their talents, which are being broadcast throughout the kingdom. He starts with Aisha, a dark elf from the protected forest. Dark elves are a minority in the kingdom, but they are exceptional in combat. They live in a forest protected by a divine safeguard and rarely interact with other races, as they are very attached to their clans. The minister announces that Aisha proved to be the best in combat and showed the highest level of military skill. Kazuya congratulates her, but Aisha humbly replies that she doesn't want any reward. Instead, she has a request. One of the guards senses danger and moves to stop her, but Kazuya stops him and lets Aisha speak. She explains that they need his help because the trees in their forest are losing their strength and it's a huge concern for them. Kazuya quickly understands the problem and explains that they need to occasionally prune the trees to prevent them from growing too large and to allow sunlight to reach the ground. This will help other plants grow and replenish the soil with nutrients and new life. Aisha is amazed by his knowledge and immediately kneels before him, pledging her loyalty. She promises to do whatever he asks, whether it's fighting to the death or even becoming his wife, as long as Kazuya helps them care for the forest. Kazuya agrees to help, and they move on to the next candidate. Next is Juna Doma, who, in addition to being one of the most beautiful women in the kingdom, has an incredible voice and is known as the best singer in the world. She comes from a prestigious family descended from sea creatures who use their voices to lure sailors. Kazuya is impressed and asks if she could sing a song for the broadcast to lift people's spirits. Juna replies that most of her songs are melancholic due to her family's heritage, but if she heard a cheerful song, she could sing it immediately. Kazuya pulls out his phone and gives her some headphones, playing a song from his world. Juna is amazed by the foreign language, but even though she doesn't understand the lyrics, she grasps the music and begins to sing. Everyone is captivated by her beautiful voice. Kazuya compliments her for singing in his language so well and for her incredible talent. Meanwhile, in the neighboring kingdom where Kazuya sold the jewels, rumors spread about him recruiting new personnel. While they don't criticize him, they wonder if he'll be able to truly recognize talent. The next candidate is a nervous young man named Pancho. As he approaches, he trips and falls. The minister explains that Pancho's talent lies in his love of food. He outate everyone in the gluttony contest. His passion for food has led him to travel all over the world, sampling dishes and rare ingredients from every corner. He's eaten almost everything that exists in this world. Kazuya stands up, offering him a hand, thanking him for coming, and telling him that he's exactly the person he's been waiting for. Hearing this, Pancho can't hold back his tears. He's always been rejected and mocked for his gluttony, and he was terrified of being turned away again. But Kazuya reassures him, telling him that he should be proud because his love for food is what will save the kingdom. With Pancho's knowledge, they can find the best food options for the people. Kazuya even gives him the name Shizuka, explaining that he expects great things from him. Overjoyed, Pancho accepts, and the entire kingdom watches as Kazuya recognizes his unique talent. The final candidate is a brilliant young man named Jairu, known for his unparalleled knowledge and memory. It's said that no one in the kingdom matches his intellect. Jairu explains that his uncle recommended him, telling him to stop reading books and start serving the kingdom. Kazuya chuckles, saying that it reminds him of his own past. He asks Jairu what kind of books he reads, and Jairu responds that he enjoys everything: history, law, military tactics, literature, anything that helps him gain knowledge. Kazuya proposes that Jairu would be perfect for managing the kingdom's library, giving him access to even more knowledge. But Jairu declines, saying that he now wants to be part of the king's military strategy team. Kazuya asks why the change of heart, and Jairu explains that he's been observing Kazuya all this time. His personal test to see if Kazuya was a good king was whether or not he accepted Pancho. Seeing how Kazuya welcomed him, Jairu realized that Kazuya truly understands what the kingdom needs. He asks to be Kazuya's strategist, leaving it to Kazuya to decide if he's fit for the position. Kazuya likes his attitude and tells him that they'll go to a meeting room later to discuss his role in detail. After this, Kazuya gave Jairu the position, and he became the Black Prime Minister. After spending the whole night discussing various topics, Kazuya referred to him as a genius and made him his right-hand man. Next up was the final candidate, a girl named Tomo Inui, who showed an unusual and unique talent. She could communicate with birds and beasts. They tested this by taking her to a stable, where she revealed each horse's medical history after asking the horses themselves. Kazuya realizes that the mystical wolves are not native to the kingdom, and Tomo is actually a refugee. However, this doesn't change her participation in the selection, and he decides to use her talents, though he's unsure how. Tomo tries to say something but is too embarrassed to speak up. Kazuya approaches her to hear her whisper in his ear, and what she says worries him, though he remains calm to avoid alarming the others. He tells Tomo that her request will be considered and asks the Prime Minister to figure out how her abilities can best serve the kingdom. Kazuya then thanks each of them for coming forward and expresses his hope that, together, they will help improve the kingdom. Later, in the king's chamber, Kazuya is with Licia and the two ministers. He asks if any of them heard what Tomo whispered to him, and they all say they couldn't hear a thing, not even on the broadcast, since the sound sensitivity isn't that high. Kazuya explains that while her ability to communicate with animals is impressive, what she told him was that she had used her power to speak with a demon. Everyone is shocked by this revelation, as up until now, it was believed that monsters in this world didn't possess higher intelligence than animals. However, some of the Demon Lord's minions are capable of using weapons and combat techniques, acting almost like humans, which is why they're called demons instead of monsters. They behave like humans, even though they can't communicate in the same language. The ministers are astonished that Tomo was able to communicate with one. Ludwin asks what they talked about. Tomo explains that she was gathering vegetables in the forest when she came across a demon about her size, with a dog-like face, resembling a scout demon. When she screamed for help, the demon was startled to hear her, as it could understand her. The demon asked if she could understand it as well. After Tomo confirmed that she could, the demon told her she should flee, as they couldn't afford to lose someone with her talent. Everyone is stunned by this encounter, and Kazuya emphasizes that this information is critical. With someone who can communicate with their enemies, they could change the course of the war. However, Kazuya warns them to be cautious. If the other kingdoms learn that they can communicate with demons, rumors could spread, leading people to believe they are allied with the Demon Lord. This would be disastrous, as wars between kingdoms are common, just like in Kazuya's own world, and having any association with demons would make them a target. Kazuya decides that they will keep Tomo's ability a secret and protect her at all costs, as she is now more important than even the king. She has the potential to change the fate of the war. He suggests assigning her guards, but the minister argues that this would raise suspicion. The best option, he says, would be to adopt her. Since Kazuya isn't married, that's not possible, and marrying Licia will take more than a year to arrange. The alternative, the minister explains, is to take her as a consort. The term refers to a secondary wife, and it would act as a cover, as she's of an acceptable age and the law allows it. Kazuya rejects this idea and instead proposes that the former kings adopt her, making her part of the royal family. Licia gets excited upon hearing this, but Tomo explains that she has a family waiting for her in the refugee camp. Kazuya assures her that if she accepts this offer, her whole family will be brought to the castle to live with her. To avoid raising suspicion, they would put her in charge of the royal stables, giving them a perfect excuse to have her live at the castle. A few days later, Kazuya speaks with Licia about how well Tomo is adjusting to life in the castle. However, Licia isn't thrilled, as they are in their room, and he hasn't requested the royal chamber. At that moment, they are interrupted by a maid, who informs them that Pancho has arrived. Kazuya and Licia go to meet him, and Pancho thanks Kazuya for lending him the hero's cloak. Thanks to its magical properties, it allowed him to store a huge amount of food without it spoiling. This helped him travel to all the places he needed to and collect the best ingredients from around the world. Licia is confused by all this, but Kazuya assures her that it will soon make sense. Later, they start a broadcast to the kingdom, with Pancho and Juna introducing Kazuya. He speaks to the people, apologizing for the food crisis. The people are surprised to see their king apologizing, but Kazuya continues, explaining that they are launching a program to increase agriculture. As part of this initiative, they will show the people how to prepare various foods, and members of the kingdom will taste test the dishes. Kazuya starts by preparing a dish using octopus, and after some time, he makes fried octopus skewers. The three women try them and are amazed by the taste. The villagers, watching the broadcast, are inspired, especially the fishermen, who normally discarded octopus as useless. Now, Seeing this, they realize they can make many new dishes from it. Next, Pancho introduces the following ingredient, which Aisha recognizes as a root from the forest where she grew up. Kanzuya prepares the root, and the women try it, enjoying its sweet and salty flavors. Aisha's brothers, watching the broadcast, are intrigued to see her enjoying the food. Pancho then presents the next dish, which makes the women nervous. It's a lobster. However, Tomo eats it without hesitation, as the flavor reminds her of home. Pancho explains that the lobster was boiled in ABA water, a seasoning used by the mystical wolves. It's made by salting and fermenting broad beans, resulting in unique products found only in their region. The process is similar to how soy sauce and miso are made, which makes Kanzuya emotional as the taste reminds him of the food from his world. The next dish Pancho presents doesn't excite anyone. It's made from slime, a weak creature with no gender. Pancho explains how to prepare it safely without it exploding, something he learned from an ancient tribe in the kingdom. He begins cooking, and the final result resembles udon noodles. The women urge Kanzuya to try it first, given that it's similar to a dish from his world. He takes a bite and is surprised by how much it tastes like noodle soup, so much so that he can't stop eating. Curious, the women try it too and are delighted by how a simple slime turned into such a delicious dish. After the final dish, Juna wraps up the broadcast, hoping the people will enjoy these meals. Pancho expresses his gratitude for the opportunity, and Kanzuya tells him that if the people want, they'll do another broadcast soon. A week later, Kanzuya receives many requests from across the kingdom, asking for more broadcasts featuring new dishes. As he reviews the requests, his maid informs him that Marx has something important to tell him. When Kanzuya meets with the minister, Marx thanks him for all his support but announces that he will step down, following the example of the former king. Marx explains that he doesn't feel capable of continuing in his leadership role and recommends that Hakuya be appointed in his place, as he's incredibly talented and loyal. Kanzuya agrees with the request and wishes Marx the best, but he doesn't want him to leave the kingdom entirely. While Marx may no longer serve as the minister, Kanzuya still needs him to help with understanding the protocols and other matters he hasn't yet mastered. Hakuya steps in, even though he hasn't officially been appointed yet, and suggests that Kanzuya take a break. He explains that if the king doesn't rest, neither will the workers. He reassures Kanzuya that he's already handled a lot of issues, so he can take the rest of the day off, go anywhere he wants, and show the people that he has free time, that he's not always cooped up in the palace. Hakuya even dares to suggest that Kanzuya go on a date with Licia to strengthen their relationship. Kanzuya is surprised at first, but after thinking about it, he realizes it's not a bad idea. Hakuya adds that if he needs an escort, Aisha, one of the kingdom's best warriors, is available. Kanzuya agrees and heads out for a walk. While walking, he comes across Licia and Aisha training their skills. Their powers are incredible, and the spells they cast leave him stunned. He quickly stops them, concerned they might damage part of the castle. He explains what Hakuya suggested, and Licia blushes a little. Meanwhile, Aisha proposes going to the forest, but Kanzuya points out that they only have the rest of the day, and a trip to the forest takes 6 days. Aisha says they can wait and head out as soon as possible since the elders of the forest are resistant to any ideas about the trees, but a personal visit from the hero might convince them. Kanzuya promises to schedule the trip soon, and Aisha thanks him, saying that she'd do anything for him. Jokingly, Kanzuya asks her to escort them on their date with Licia, but he clarifies that it's not really a date, just a walk around the kingdom. A while later, they change clothes, and Kanzuya is enchanted by how Licia looks. Aisha asks how she looks in her uniform, and Kanzuya replies that it's strange, as he never imagined dark elves dressing this way. Aisha gets a bit down, feeling like she disappointed him, and jokes that if he didn't like it, she could just go without clothes. Licia laughs and says that everyone looks good as they are, and they head out to the city in a carriage. Kanzuya tells them that when they step out of the carriage, they should act like military students, not royalty. To stay undercover, they'll call him Kanzuya instead of Soma to avoid being recognized. The three of them spend the afternoon visiting various places and walking around the city. While taking a break, Licia comments on how nice it feels since she's always on horseback and never had time to explore on foot. Aisha mentions that she's hungry, so they head to a cafe where Juna works. She almost blows their cover when she sees them, but Kanzuya quickly improvises a story, and Juna plays along. They order some slime soup, and Juna tells them that ever since the broadcast, Many people have been requesting it because it's affordable and everyone loves it. Licia asks Kazuya why he's so kind and different toward Juna compared to everyone else. Kazuya admits that he can't help it, he gets nervous around girls who are too pretty. He then scolds Aisha for the way she's eating. Juna remarks that when she first met Aisha, she seemed like a confident and strong-willed woman. Aisha is surprised to hear this and wonders if this is why, despite offering herself fully to Kazuya, he hasn't invited her to his room. Kazuya is embarrassed by the comment and insists that he won't do that since he's already engaged. Licia chimes in, explaining that in this kingdom, a man can have multiple wives, especially the king. Although she's not too thrilled about it, she understands, adding that she would accept up to 8 other women besides her. As they continue their conversation, they overhear a couple arguing at the table next to them. Kazuya asks if the girl arguing is a mystical wolf like Tomo, but Licia explains that she's more like a mystical fox, pointing out the difference in their tails. Juna warns Kazuya that mistaking a mystical fox for a wolf would offend both races. Licia recognizes the man with the girl. It's Albert Magna, the eldest son of the prestigious Magna family, known for being an excellent writer. She's confused about why he's here. Juna explains that the girl is a regular customer and a mage from the Forbidden Army. The girl is pleading with Albert not to go to Duke Carmine, as the Duke doesn't have good relations with Kazuya as the new king, and it could lead to civil war. This only motivates Albert further, saying that war would be a chance to rise in the world. The girl tries to reason with him, saying his parents are worried about his decision, but Albert is determined. He trusts Duke Carmine. The girl warns him that the Duke has isolated himself in his territory and refuses to acknowledge Kazuya as the new king. There's suspicion that he's planning to start a war against Kazuya to seize new lands. Kazuya recalls what Hakuya told him about the neighboring countries. Many of them don't have good relations with the kingdom. 4 are neutral, and 1 is outright hostile. This tension escalated after the demon invasion, and it's likely that several of these countries are looking for an opportunity to attack now that there's a new king. Some have been sending troops under the guise of defensive support, but it's clear that they are preparing to side with the kingdom's 3 dukes against the new king. Kazuya continues listening to the couple's conversation, wondering why they would attack him so directly. Albert explains that many nobles don't recognize Kazuya as the king and are allying with Duke Carmine to strengthen their position. The girl argues that Kazuya only removed corrupt nobles who were stealing from the kingdom, which is why they're upset with him. She adds that if Duke Carmine accepts these troops, it means his intentions are not good. Albert argues that a young, inexperienced king can't be trusted, but the girl insists that Kazuya is different. He's proven himself reliable. Kazuya decides to intervene, asking the girl why she thinks that. Not realizing she's speaking to the king, the girl explains how Kazuya reorganized the military, improved the quality of soldiers and supplies, and worked to solve the food crisis. She believes these actions show that he genuinely cares about the kingdom. Then, as she gets a good look at him, she realizes she's speaking to Soma, the new king. Kazuya takes them to a more private location and explains that he was taking the day off to visit the city. Albert, still unaware of who he's talking to, grows irritated and accuses Kazuya of bothering them unnecessarily. At that moment, Albert raises his hand, and Aisha quickly restrains him. Kazuya tells her to let him go, and Albert asks, "Who do you think you are?" Kazuya seizes the opportunity and changes his demeanor, revealing himself as the true king. Albert, realizing his mistake, hides in shame. Kazuya then asks if he plans to side with Duke Carmine. Albert doesn't respond, but Kazuya tells him that he wouldn't blame him. Everyone has the right to choose their leader. However, he warns Albert that if he sides with the dukes, when the time comes for war, he'll be standing against his friend, Keed. Kazuya asks if Albert would be able to raise his sword against her. He also warns that someone on Albert's side might end up killing his childhood friend, and as her enemy, he wouldn't be allowed to protect her. Albert is left in shock by Kazuya's words. Kazuya tells him to think carefully about his path, fighting for his friend, not against her. Later, they leave the cafe and head to a park to rest. Aisha falls asleep, and Licia asks Kazuya if his real intention was to convince Albert not to make a mistake. Kazuya replies that he was just being realistic, telling Albert what would happen if he made certain choices. Licia finds his honesty admirable and asks if he would like to lay his head on her lap. Kazuya gets flustered but reminds her that this is supposed to be a date. Eventually, he gives in, and Licia reflects on the time Kazuya told her that she would be the one to stay on the throne when he leaves. She then asks him if he's really serious about getting engaged to her. Kazuya responds that it's not for her to ask, that's the man's job. He flips the question back to her, and Licia blushes, saying she has no problem with it, but feels a bit embarrassed about sounding so in love. She uses the excuse that he's proven himself more than capable of being king. Kazuya tells her she shouldn't agree to marry someone she doesn't love, even if political marriages are common in the royal family. However, he's not a part of that tradition and says he wants to marry for love. Licia asks if he thinks he'll ever fall in love with her. Kazuya is caught off guard, but before he can answer, Aisha interrupts, saying it's uncomfortable pretending to be asleep. The next day, Kazuya shows Licia that he can now control 4 objects with his consciousness. Just then, the maid arrives, informing him that Albert and his father, along with Keed, have requested an audience. When Kazuya meets with them, he notices that Albert is badly beaten. Albert's father begs for Kazuya's forgiveness, explaining that Keed told him everything, how Albert had treated Kazuya, how he had considered joining the enemy's side, and how he now takes full responsibility for his son's actions, admitting it's his own fault for not raising him better. Kazuya tells him that the responsibility lies with him as the king and that he shouldn't worry. He reassures the father that he has no problem with Albert and that it looks like the boy has already been punished enough. The father thanks him profusely for his words and promises that he will ensure Albert learns his lesson. Kazuya, however, advises him not to be too harsh on the boy and then turns to Keed, realizing that her talent far exceeds that of a regular mage. He proposes that she become part of his royal guard as an officer in the general staff. Keed is shocked by this sudden offer. Kazuya explains that she's already proven herself capable by how she managed supplies and personnel, as she demonstrated the day before. Her knowledge shows they think similarly. Hearing this, Keed accepts, and Kazuya tells Albert that he will now support her in the Forbidden Army as her deputy. With that, Kazuya prepares to end the meeting, but Albert's father asks for one more thing, something he'd rather discuss in private. Kazuya dismisses everyone else and asks the man what's on his mind. The father shares some troubling news, which worries Kazuya. It's serious, and he'll need to handle it carefully. Meanwhile, Albert and Keed sit down for tea with Licia. The maid asks how they maintain such a good relationship, as it would be helpful for Licia's relationship with Kazuya. Embarrassed, Licia tells her to ignore the comment. Afterward, Kazuya explains that magic in this world is divided into 6 different elements: fire, water, earth, air, light, and darkness. The first 4 elements are used for various magical attacks, while light is primarily used for healing magic. Darkness is unique, encompassing all forms of magic that don't fall into the other 5 categories. Magic can also be imbued into weapons, as Licia demonstrated during her training. Some mages can even create powerful magic out of thin air. Depending on their nature, mages are assigned to different roles. Earth mages, for example, are part of the king's secret army. Kazuya himself specializes in dark magic, which doesn't fit into any of the other categories. After explaining this, Kazuya uses his magic to create a servant-like puppet. He sends it to a guild to join an adventuring party. The other members of the group are unsure at first but ultimately accept it based on good recommendations. They set out on a mission to explore some tunnels and encounter several monsters. Kazuya's puppet demonstrates great skill, using its magic to take down each of the monsters they face. After walking for a while, they come across a giant salamander. The party is terrified, having never seen a monster of this size. When the leader tries to attack it with his sword, Kazuya stops him, warning that close combat is dangerous because of the salamander's poisonous fluids. The mage suggests using magic attacks, but they won't work either, as fire is ineffective against the salamander. As they flee, dodging the creature's attacks, Kazuya's puppet stumbles and gets hit by the monster's fluids. It manages to get back up and keep running, and eventually, the group escapes safely. The party members are baffled, wondering how the puppet survived the attack and how one of the girls in the group seems to almost understand what the puppet is saying, even though it can't speak. Later that night, Kazuya is cleaning the puppet when Licia walks in, commenting that it's much bigger than before. Kazuya explains that he asked a craftsman to help him improve it, and he controls it with his magic. Licia realizes that this is the adventurer mascot that everyone in the kingdom has been talking about. Kazuya admits that he's the one controlling it and that he joined an adventurer's party as part of a plan to investigate the secret tunnels. The adventure itself was also a fun way to relax. A few days later, Kanzuya gathers everyone who has helped him with the kingdom's reforms and congratulates them on their hard work, staying up late to write out the new laws and reforms. He gives a motivational speech, praising them for choosing to work in the palace instead of being with their families. He tells them that their efforts have paid off because, thanks to them, they finally have the capital to launch the Bene Innova project. Kanzuya explains to Licia that this project aims to build a new city along the coast, with the goal of creating the kingdom's largest port. Licia notes that they already have a port, but Kanzuya explains that the current one is under the control of the Duchess. By building a new city, they'll also construct new roads, which will improve transportation between cities and neighboring kingdoms, facilitating the flow of resources by both sea and land. Once completed, Bene Innova will become the kingdom's main city, its heart, and the roads connecting it will be the arteries, greatly boosting the economy throughout the realm. Kanzuya explains how supply and demand work. With an efficient distribution of resources, they can prevent shortages and keep prices balanced across the kingdom. He adds that food is the most sought-after resource, but due to poor harvests, it's currently very scarce, causing prices to skyrocket. Kanzuya explains that no matter how expensive food gets, people will still need to eat, and they'll spend all their money on it. But if the price of food goes down, people will have more money to spend on other things, which will stimulate the economy. Back at the meeting, Kanzuya continues to praise and thank his workers, telling them that although their names may not be recorded in history books, their contributions are far more significant than that of soldiers on the battlefield. He promises that he will never forget what they have done for him and the kingdom. He also announces that as a reward for their hard work, they'll have 5 days off. Since the kingdom doesn't have the funds to give them medals of honor, he offers each of them a bottle of wine, which they can enjoy however they like. This gesture makes everyone very happy. Later, Licia asks if Kanzuya thinks he went overboard with his praise. Kanzuya admits that maybe he got carried away, having worked so hard for so long. Even though he could rest his consciousness occasionally, he pushed himself to the limit to ensure the project's success. Licia, understanding this, asks him not to overwork himself, confessing that she's afraid of losing him. Kanzuya laughs and jokingly says that if anything happens to him, they could always summon another hero. Licia is shocked by this comment, but Kanzuya doesn't realize it and says he's going to take a nap to recover his strength. He also tells her that when he wakes up, they'll review the city plans together before falling asleep instantly. Licia, watching him sleep, whispers that she wouldn't accept another hero because it wouldn't be Kanzuya, he's the hero she wants. She then gives him a sweet kiss to ensure he sleeps happily. The next day, Kanzuya arrives at the site where the new city construction will begin. As they walk, Soma wonders why such a well-located place with suitable land for construction hasn't been used before. At that moment, they are greeted by Ludwin, who informs them that everything was going according to plan, but a small problem has come up, and he wants to discuss it in private. Inside the tent, Ludwin explains that some people from a distant village are opposing the construction, led by an elder named Europe. They insist that the city shouldn't be built there. Soma asks why they are so against it, and Ludwin explains that, according to them, the land belongs to Kahin, an ancient sea god. The elder said that if anything were built in the area, it would provoke the god's wrath. Soma asks everyone present if they believe in gods. The girls respond that they don't, but they acknowledge that some people do hold strong beliefs. Ludwin says he doesn't believe in gods, but the legend claims that if anything is built on the sacred land, a giant sea monster will emerge and devour everything in its path. Soma reflects on these words and asks Ludwin to take him to the elder immediately to hear more about Kahin. A little while later, they arrive at the elder's house. At first, the elder is irritated and asks who Soma is, but upon realizing that he's speaking to the king, he's shocked and invites them inside. Once inside, the elder explains the situation, begging Soma to reconsider building the city on sacred land, as those who attempted it before were all devoured by the god's wrath. Soma asks him to mark on a map the boundaries of the sacred land. Afterward, Soma meets with Hakuya and explains that while he doesn't believe in this sea god, the legend could be based on real events, possibly natural disasters like tsunamis. Ludwin says there are no records of tsunamis in the area, but Soma counters that they may be extremely rare, occurring once every 100, 200, or even thousands of years. Before returning to the castle, Soma decides to speak with neighboring villages about any destructive rumors associated with the god and maps out the area where the tsunami could potentially hit. Hakuya asks if he will cancel the construction project, but Soma refuses, saying they won't stop building the city, but they will move it to a nearby location. Ludwin asks if he's sure about changing the site based on an unconfirmed rumor of a tsunami. Soma replies that they can't risk the destruction of the main city, pointing out that the elders mentioned that the ground shakes just before the god's wrath strikes. He explains that this is exactly what happens during an earthquake preceding a tsunami, where the ocean floor rises and then collapses. Realizing they don't fully understand what he's talking about, Soma simplifies it, saying they mustn't take any risks with the city. He adds that they'll adjust the construction plans to elevate the city, making it more resistant to potential earthquakes. Ludwin agrees that this will take a bit more time, but with the help of earth mages, they can raise the ground. Soma and the others start discussing the changes to the plans, while the girls chat among themselves about how excited Soma is about the new city, showing how much he cares for the kingdom. Licia asks Aisha if she thinks Soma likes her, and Aisha immediately stands up and declares that yes, Soma does like her. Licia suggests that they should support their king to keep him happy and motivated. If you've made it this far into the video, leave the word king in the comments. The first few people to do so will get a heart, and you'll help me keep bringing more videos. Now, let's continue with the summary. Soma then reflects on how different the technology in this world is. Despite the presence of magic, they have warships like the Albert, a forbidden army warship. Although technology in this world is underdeveloped, they managed to make these iron ships float and equip them with weapons. Since they don't have engines, they use domesticated sea dragons to pull the ships across great distances. It's similar to how their cannons work. In this world, they already have gunpowder, but they haven't invented firearms yet. However, Soma notes that they don't really need guns because magic allows them to launch long-range attacks. Magic also enhances objects and weapons, making swords sharper and shields stronger. While they don't have firearms, their ships are equipped with cannons because water magic wouldn't be as effective in naval battles. This makes Soma realize that in this world, things are invented based on what's necessary, posing a challenge for everything he plans to accomplish in the kingdom. A few days later, the Sacred Army is constructing roads leading to the new city. Hal wonders why the army has to do it, but Keith scolds him, explaining that while many people don't have much work, they lack the skills to build durable roads. That's why the army has to handle it, ensuring that the new network of roads will efficiently connect the entire kingdom. Still, Hal finds it odd that the army is taking on this task. Later, as they eat, Keith explains that the dish they're enjoying is something new the king invented after reorganizing the mystical wolves, giving them a special area to develop their own crops and ingredients, which are now used in the kingdom's meals. Thanks to them, they have fresh vegetables, as the nearby village is growing them along the new road, allowing food to reach the people fresher and faster. Keith excitedly tells Hal that the new road system has improved transportation, making products easier to sell and increasing production while lowering food prices. They are now very close to solving the food crisis, all thanks to their king, whose knowledge is so incredible it sometimes scares them. At that moment, Soma arrives with Licia, greeting Hal, who stiffens up and greets him formally. Soma tells him there's no need to be so formal, reminding him that this isn't the same attitude Hal had when they first met. Hal apologizes, and Soma tells him he can speak more casually. Later, Soma and the others go out to inspect the road construction. Licia is amazed, having never seen a road being built before. Soma explains the process and tells her about Roman concrete, a material used in his world that is so durable that some buildings made from it have lasted over 2,000 years and are still standing. Licia asks about the lamps along the road, and Keith explains that they are designed to light up the road at night. Soma adds that they've also planted trees along the road, which are protective. Aisha explains that the trees are from her forest and have a special characteristic: they emit a constant frequency that monsters and animals hate, which keeps them away. In her village, they use these trees as a barrier to protect the entire area. Soma says that while the trees are effective, they won't rely on them as a complete barrier because they can't block the natural flow of wildlife. There are many animals, like wolves and bears, that roam constantly to hunt, and if the road is fully blocked, any animal that manages to get in would head straight for the city, causing even more problems. So, instead of stopping them completely, it's better to just deter them. At that moment, a bird flies down from the sky, chirping. Keith tells them it's a CUI, a type of bird with an excellent tracking ability, able to detect its owner's frequency from anywhere. It lands on Aisha's hand and delivers a letter. Aisha reads it and is immediately worried. It's from her father, informing her that a landslide occurred in the protected forest the previous night, destroying half the village. Recent heavy rains have caused the disaster, and many people are missing. Hearing this, Soma quickly assesses the situation and asks Ki for information on their current forces. She provides the details, and Soma orders the group to mobilize immediately to help the village. Aisha initially tries to refuse, not wanting to trouble them, but Soma insists, telling her that it's within his power to send people to help. He urges her to accept the help and save as many as possible. With tears in her eyes, Aisha agrees, and Ki rushes off to gather the troops. Soma then tells Licia to return to the capital and send reinforcements to assist, and he asks Hakuya to send emergency supplies. He asks Aisha how long it will take to reach the village. She says it's half a day by horse, but about 2 days on foot. Soma realizes that time is critical in this emergency since the survival rate drops significantly after 72 hours. They don't have enough horses to quickly move an entire army. As he thinks about what to do, Soma notices a cargo carriage and comes up with an idea. Soon after, the army members are traveling in carriages, allowing them to move much faster. They arrive at the village by nightfall. Aisha's father, Won, the village leader, introduces himself to Soma, who responds that there's no time for formalities, they need to focus on the rescue efforts. He informs Won that he brought 50 soldiers and that more reinforcements and supplies will arrive in the coming days, but he needs to know the current situation. Won shows him the affected area, explaining that so far, they have counted over 100 dead and more than 40 missing. After hearing the report, Soma asks for a list of the missing people so they can be checked off as they're found. He also orders some people to keep an eye on the mountain in case it shifts or there's another landslide. Aisha volunteers to handle that, and Won agrees, noting that his daughter played in those mountains as a child and knows the area well. Soma accepts this, then gathers the army to give them instructions on how to safely clear the area, stressing the importance of staying aware of the mountain's condition to prevent further accidents. Everyone immediately gets to work searching for survivors, including Soma himself. At one point, he hears a noise and quickly calls for help to lift some logs. With assistance, they manage to free someone trapped under a tree. Hal is amazed that Soma knew exactly where to find the person, but Soma explains that it's thanks to a wooden mouse he created with his magic, which he sent to places they couldn't reach. He also mentions that he originally made the mice for other purposes, but they've proven very useful in this emergency. Suddenly, Soma vomits and apologizes to Hal, explaining that one of his mice found some remains that were in a terrible state, and because he shares consciousness with the mice, it hit him hard. Later, Won thanks Soma, as they've managed to find all the missing people, though unfortunately, not all of them are alive. Just then, Aisha arrives and informs them that Licia has arrived with a new group of aid workers. However, they are interrupted by a dark elf who tearfully declares that it's too late. Soma approaches the elf, agreeing that they have found everyone who was missing, but reminds him that this is just the first step. They still have many injured to treat and debris to clear, so there's a lot more work to do. The elf, looking Soma in the eye, says that none of that will bring back the people they've lost. Won steps in, apologizing for his brother's outburst, explaining that he's deeply affected because he lost his wife, and his daughter is in critical condition. The man, full of anger, stands and asks why, after serving the forest his entire life, it has now taken away everything he loves. Won reprimands him, saying now is not the time to look for someone to blame, he should be focusing on his daughter. Hearing this, the man apologizes and collapses to the ground, crying from his overwhelming sense of helplessness. Soma, witnessing this, steps outside, and Aisha explains that her uncle was one of those who opposed trimming the trees, as he was one of the forest guardians and couldn't allow it. She asks Soma if trimming the trees would have made a difference. Soma responds that there's no way to know for sure. While it's true that maintaining a forest helps the roots absorb more water and could prevent landslides, it wouldn't have been a guaranteed solution in this case. Intense rainfall can still cause disasters. However, regular forest maintenance, alongside evacuation routes and emergency plans, would be the best approach. Soma adds that while protecting the forest sounds noble, nature isn't as fragile as people think. Nature constantly destroys and creates, and it's humans who try to maintain it in a way that benefits them. After days of assisting in the efforts, Soma and his caravan leave the village. Soma thanks Licia for her help, but he feels guilty for not being able to do more. Licia reassures him, saying that he did a lot for the village, but Soma insists it wasn't enough. His job as king is to prepare for situations like this, not lead a rescue team, so he feels he failed in this case. He tells her they need a lot more, such as a system for exchanging information quickly over long distances and emergency supplies in every village, including medical and rescue equipment. However, He admits he's been so focused on the food crisis and the three dukes that he neglected these other things, and the weight of his failures overwhelms him to the point of tears, feeling like he's not fit to be king. A few days later, Juna arrives in Soma's room. She finds him lying on his bed, reading several documents. Soma tells her he hasn't been able to sleep well because his body is exhausted, but his mind is racing with too many thoughts. Juna understands and sits beside him, asking him to lie down properly. Soma obeys, and Juna tells him it's okay to feel weak sometimes. He always has to appear strong in front of Licia and the kingdom, but when things get too tough, she's there for him. At that moment, Juna notices Soma has fallen asleep. She whispers in his ear, suggesting that perhaps it's Licia who makes him feel strong, but maybe he could show his vulnerability to her. Then, she starts singing a lullaby to help him rest even more peacefully. The next day, in the lands of Duke Carmine, the three dukes gather. Castor insists that they should defeat the current king, but the Duchess isn't convinced about attacking, preferring to wait for neighboring countries to start a war. Castor, however, reveals that he's received a letter from Amadonia, promising to send troops to defeat the false king. The Duchess asks Duke Carmine what he plans to do, noting that the new king is doing things well, and she sees no reason to attack him. Carmine responds that the new king has ignored many things, claiming that as a summoned hero from another world, Soma doesn't know or understand the history and betrayals of the kingdom. Furthermore, since his arrival, he's removed long-serving ministers from the palace. The Duchess accuses Carmine of being obsessed with the throne, but he denies it, saying that once he wins, he plans to put Albert back on the throne as before. The Duchess, upon hearing this, agrees to wait for his decision, asking him not to involve their children in this matter. However, at that moment, her daughter Carla bursts in, declaring that she will fight against the king because he dethroned Albert and mistreated her friend Licia. Meanwhile, in Amadonia, the king receives a letter from Carmine, confirming his position on what he plans to do against Soma, news they had been waiting for. The king tells his son that they will send troops to support the war. The son asks which side they'll help, and the king reveals that they'll send troops to both sides. Their true goal is the complete destruction of the territory. Later, Hakuya gives Soma a report with good news. The harvest predictions are excellent, and they no longer need to worry about food. The food crisis has been resolved, but now a more critical decision needs to be made. Hearing this, Soma realizes the truth and recalls the words of Niccolò Machiavelli that cruelty should only be used as a last resort, but it's addictive and often brings ruin to those who use it. Soma tells Hakuya that his plan to deal with the three dukes feels like it falls into that cruelty Machiavelli warned about. Hakuya argues that it's necessary to face them directly. Soma, reflecting on this, remembers his grandfather's advice to find a family and protect them. This motivates Soma, and he decides to proceed with his plan to subdue the kingdom of Amadonia. The king of Amadonia addresses his army, announcing that the time has come to invade Soma's territory, but his speech is interrupted by the minister, who pleads with him to reconsider, warning that a war would cause immense suffering due to hunger. Angry, the king kicks the minister, insisting that since Soma came to power, his army has grown stronger, so it's now or never to strike. The minister reminds him that they are part of the joint human alliance against the demon race, an agreement established by the great empire of chaos after the war against the demons began. This declaration prohibits wars between countries while they unite to fight the demons, making it an international treaty. The minister warns that if they invade another kingdom, they will face sanctions from the other countries. The king's son counters, stating that Soma's kingdom hasn't signed the declaration, so there's no legal binding preventing them from attacking. The king, hearing this, agrees and suspends the minister from his duties for his continued objections. Later, Minister Colbert walks out of the palace in sadness, where the princess meets him, cheerfully telling him to pack his things because they are leaving the palace for a while. Colbert is confused, but the princess explains that she has a plan. They're going to escape the palace. Meanwhile, Soma discusses his upcoming meeting with the three dukes with Licia, asking for her help. A little while later, they gather in a room with three large screens, each displaying one of the three dukes. Soma introduces himself as the acting king to whom Albert ceded the throne. The dukes introduce themselves, and without wasting time, Soma informs them that if they continue to disobey their king's orders, they will be considered traitors. He then asks for their opinions on the matter. Duchess Excel asks what Soma plans to do with the three dukes. Soma replies that as long as they don't betray him, he won't take any action against them, and their forces will be integrated into the Forbidden Army, forming a new, unified military force. However, he makes it clear that he won't allow them to maintain separate military forces within their territories. Castor, upon hearing this, warns Soma to be careful with his demands, as he sounds like a dictator trying to establish his own racial supremacy, which could lead to conflict with other races. He also refuses to unify the armies, pointing out that the kingdom's founders designed the current system so that the dukes could hold power in case someone endangered the kingdom. Soma counters that while this system works in times of peace, they are now facing threats from multiple invading kingdoms, so a united army is necessary. Castor challenges him, asking what would happen if this unified army became corrupt and who would be held responsible. Without hesitation, Soma replies that if that were to happen, the three dukes would have permission to take his head. This bold statement shocks the dukes for a few seconds. Excel then asks about the new city Soma is building, as her territory contains the main port, and she wants to know if he plans to take the port away from her kingdom. Soma explains that while the new city will have a port, its main focus will be tourism, meaning her territory and port will remain the kingdom's primary naval hub. Relieved, Excel bows and pledges her loyalty, along with her territory and army, to Soma. Soma thanks her for her decision and looks forward to working together to improve the kingdom. Then, he turns to Castor, hoping he will make a wise choice, but Castor firmly refuses to accept Soma as king, citing his suspicion over Albert's sudden abdication without notifying the dukes. He also declares his alliance with Carmine, though he clarifies that only 100 of his high-ranking generals will join him, while the rest of his army will remain neutral, a decision that surprises Hakuya, as he knows this will significantly weaken their military forces. After hearing this, Soma turns to the last duke, saying he won't ask him about his position since accepting those involved in corruption made his intentions clear. However, he does ask what led him to that decision. The duke responds that it was more his pride as a warrior, unwilling to leave the kingdom in the hands of someone he doesn't trust. Soma tells him he's mistaken and that there's nothing more to say, but he proposes that the dukes not prolong the battle or cause unnecessary loss of life. He explains that if one defeats the leader of the others, they'll take control of the troops without needing to eliminate them. The dukes agree to this, and Carmine stands to leave, but Lycia interrupts by drawing her sword, cutting off her hair, and tossing it into the air, symbolizing that she is renouncing her role as princess and fully aligning herself with Soma and his reign. Duke Carmine, surprised, says he now understands her decision and leaves. Afterward, Soma apologizes to Excel for failing to convince Castor, but she reassures him that it's fine, she already knew the duke's decision. At that moment, Lycia is joined by Juna, Excel's granddaughter, who it turns out was the one observing Soma and informing her grandmother of his promise as a king, which was reason enough to side with him. Soma thanks her for this, and Lycia reminds him that they are all now part of his reign. A few days later, Hakuya informs Soma that the king of Amadonia has launched an invasion of the kingdom with over 30,000 soldiers. He explains that they've already reached the first city, and the city leader kneels before them, begging for mercy and asking for more time. As his people are divided, some want to surrender while others want to fight. As their leader, he promises that with more time, he can convince them not to fight, building a stronger army. His son, however, advises that they not fight and conserve as much of their forces as possible, urging the king to accept the deal. The king of Amadonia believes he's already won, as combining his forces with those of Duke Carmine gives them over 40,000 soldiers, far outnumbering Soma's 10,000 troops, which makes victory seem assured. Meanwhile, a battle is unfolding with the dukes, as Keed and Halal defend the walls with many soldiers. Keed remarks on Soma's clever move, mobilizing 10,000 Forbidden Army soldiers to the borders right after meeting with the dukes, constructing a wall and preventing the invasion, something they were able to do quickly thanks to the new roads and transportation methods Soma had established. As the battle rages, Keed notices the enemies have artillery cannons, which their magic defenses can't block. The army begins attacking, and the wall is barely holding up against the blasts. Just as they're considering their options, an archer arrives and destroys one of the incoming shots. The archer introduces himself as Sir, from the protected forest, and explains that he's repaying a debt for saving his daughter during the recent disaster. His daughter told him she wants to follow their example and join the army. On another front, Ludwin, the leader of the cavalry, orders the gates to be opened, but their goal is solely to destroy the cannons and return to their base, avoiding confrontation with the enemy troops. Duke Carmine watches as his most powerful weapons are destroyed, and his army begins to retreat. The corrupt dukes confront Carmine about what's happening, but he reassures them that their forces are still 4 times larger, so there's no reason to fear. They'll defeat Soma's army without a problem. Carmine knows Soma isn't at the front line since the Forbidden Army has only been acting defensively, which tells him they must be planning something. He says they need to force Soma's hand. Back in Amadonia, the king grows impatient and orders the attack, but just as he does, he hears screams from within the city. A merchant arrives, apologizing for failing to convince his companions to surrender. He explains that the screams are from warriors who refuse to give up, prepared to die in battle. The king's son advises that fighting against an army willing to die is dangerous, as they could lose many soldiers. The city leader pleads for more time, offering gold from his city and promising to convince his people by the next afternoon. The king, after hearing this, agrees and promises not to attack until the following afternoon. Inside the city, it's revealed that this is all part of Duchess Excel's plan to buy Soma more time. She explains to her servant that time is their only hope, as they're up against 2 dukes and the king of Amadonia. The minister reminds her that they only gain time until the next afternoon, but Excel says that's enough to give Soma the time he needs. She also warns that if Soma doesn't make a move by then, they'll be destined to die as heroes in the fortress. After several days of fighting, the king of Amadonia announces that it's time to launch the attack since their time is up. But a scout interrupts, warning that the Air Force is approaching. It's revealed that, the previous night, in Duke Castor's castle, his minister informed him that the city had been evacuated, leaving only military personnel and their families. Castor, reflecting on Soma's leadership, admits that despite being young, Soma is a good king. When asked if he regrets his decision, Castor admits he does, but insists it's too late now. He orders that all requests for help be rejected, as he refuses to support corrupt dukes like Carmine or anyone else. The minister then informs Castor that 10,000 Forbidden Army soldiers are heading toward Duke Carmine's position, though it's unclear if Soma is with them. Castor notes that Soma is making a mistake. He should have come for him first, taken control of his air force, and then moved on to Carmine. But the minister reminds Castor that Soma doesn't have a large enough army to defeat his air force. Castor starts to wonder what Soma could be planning when his daughter bursts in, announcing a major problem. A warship is approaching their territory. Everyone rushes out to see the warship, which is the kingdom's strongest but now fitted with wheels and being pulled by giant monsters. Meanwhile, during a conference, Soma explains that he had no other choice because his army was too limited. Castor asks why he did this, and Soma responds that it's to attack him. At that moment, the ship's cannons begin firing. Castor, infuriated, bursts into laughter, admitting that Soma is far craftier and a better king than he ever imagined. Our protagonist, on the other hand, tells Castor that he could still surrender and make things easier, but Castor refuses, saying he won't do something so dishonorable. He then sends his daughter to destroy the cannon and explains that the only way he'll accept him as king is if he wins this battle. Meanwhile, Castor's daughter flies with the air force of dragons toward the forest, but the ship fires automated spears that surprise the army, forcing them to dodge all the attacks. This defense system is only used in the kingdom's bases. After evading the attacks and reaching the ship, they realize there are no soldiers on board, only a puppet in armor controlling the missiles. Castor's daughter realizes they were tricked, leaving the city and her father defenseless in the castle. At the same time, our protagonist infiltrates the castle using the blueprints. Along with his companions, they reach Castor. Castor, impressed by the strategy, tells our protagonist that this is where it will all be decided. If he loses, he will swear loyalty and lead his entire air force under our protagonist's command. Soma asks why Castor doesn't surrender now, and Castor replies that his word is his honor, and he already swore to fight. He then draws his sword, but Aisha steps in front of our protagonist to fight Castor herself. The duel begins, with Castor demonstrating his fighting skills, but Aisha skillfully counters his attacks, declaring that she will serve Soma no matter the outcome. At a critical moment, one of our protagonist's puppets blocks Castor's attack, and Lycia joins the battle, casting an ice magic attack that, combined with Aisha's strikes, easily defeats Castor. On the ground, Castor asks Lycia if Soma is a good king. Lycia confidently replies that he is, and if her father ever wanted the throne back, she would fight alongside Soma because she completely trusts him. At that moment, they hear the ship's explosion, and Lycia places a slave collar on Castor, preventing him from acting against Soma. Soon after, Carla storms in, furious about what they put on her father, but Castor tells her they have lost, and she surrenders, accepting a slave collar as well. Soma orders the minister to unite Castor's forces with the Dark Army and to announce Castor's capture before sending them to the battle at Carmine's region. Back in the present, everyone is shocked to see Castor's air force arrive, but the dragons start attacking Duke Carmine's forces, bombing his castle and military power. Meanwhile, Soma meets with Hal and Aisha at the containment wall, discussing tactics with his leaders. Carla is impressed by the warriors' trust in their king. In Carmine's castle, the ministers are terrified after being betrayed by the Air Force, awaiting new orders. Carmine asks about the damage from the bombardment, and his commander reports that few structures were damaged, but there is no way to escape without being eliminated. Realizing they are trapped, Carmine accepts their defeat. The ministers criticize Carmine for surrendering, suggesting they use soldiers and civilians as shields to defend themselves. Infuriated, Carmine orders slave collars be placed on the ministers, as he can't trust those who would use civilians as hostages. Soma, on the other hand, congratulates his forces for their excellent work on the containment wall and orders his troops to mobilize, declaring the war is over. All the girls are amazed to hear this, but at the same time, Duke Carmine surrenders and orders his commander to send a message announcing the surrender of his entire army and people. Meanwhile, Carmine, alone in his hall, takes out a vintage wine that Albert had given him, which he had hoped to use for Lycia's wedding. He knows his life is now in Soma's hands and plans to enjoy the wine while he can. However, his captain enters, informing him that Soma and his army are moving west towards Amadonia's invasion. Hearing this, Carmine recalls a conversation with Soma about ignoring outdated protocols, and he feels proud of Soma's decisive actions. He immediately orders his army to follow and celebrate their new king's wisdom. On the way to Duchess Excel, Soma explains to Carla why they are heading there. He tells her that his main target wasn't the three dukes, but when he learned about Carmine's plan and how he sided with corrupt nobles, it reminded him of Hal's father's warning that Duke Carmine was gathering corrupt nobles to stage a rebellion against the new king. This would encourage the most corrupt nobles to join his side, but he would then allow himself to be defeated to rid the kingdom of them all in one blow. Our protagonist becomes upset upon hearing this news, but Hal's father explains that it was all planned by the Duke. The corrupt nobles had gained too much influence in one area, and many of them had even hired armies from other kingdoms to protect their stolen lands. This meant they wouldn't allow the kingdom to reclaim them and would pretend to be kidnapped, keeping both their lands and their money. Upon hearing all of this, our protagonist is angry with the Duke's decision, as it tarnishes the reputation of a brilliant mind by painting him as a traitor. However, Hal's father insists that the Duke's intention was to save the kingdom and entrust its future to the new king. Our protagonist explains to everyone present that he had not shared this information with anyone else, except for Lycia the night before the battle. He had wanted to explain the strategy to Duke Castor, but he knew that revealing the entire plan could jeopardize everything they had worked for. Meanwhile, in the city being invaded, the Amadonia army prepares to attack in full force, but they see Duchess Excel standing in front of them. The king's son tells his father that it must be a trap, and they should retreat. At that moment, Excel uses her water magic to create a wall in front of her, projecting a transmission from our protagonist. The same transmission is being broadcast throughout Soma's kingdom. In the broadcast, Soma announces that he has defeated the two dukes who opposed him, uniting all the military forces and ending the civil war. However, he explains that the conflict isn't over yet, as the kingdom of Amadonia has taken advantage of the internal situation and launched an invasion led by its king. Soma questions if they shouldn't unite as kingdoms to fight against the demons rather than waging unjustified wars against each other, and right then, he declares war on Amadonia. The king of Amadonia becomes furious upon hearing this, but Soma informs him that, at that very moment, an army is heading toward Amadonia's capital. While the king has been wasting time in the city, Soma's forces are preparing to burn everything down and claim his territory. Alarmed, the king of Amadonia orders his troops to march back to the capital immediately. Meanwhile, in the princess's chamber, she receives the news that her father has retreated from the invasion. She already knows that if they return, it won't be with their full army, understanding the intelligence of our protagonist and planning to ambush the king in a valley. The informant confirms this, explaining that, according to rumors, it was terrifying. In the middle of the night, arrows rained from the sky, and all they could hear were screams. As a result, many were lost, and their army of 30,000 was cut down to half by the time they exited the valley. Still, the king managed to gather more troops from villages and towns. However, When they finally reached the capital, they saw that it was already flying the flags of Soma's kingdom, although the castle still bore the flags of their old kingdom. At the same time, our protagonist receives news that the enemy army is advancing. Soma decides that it is time for a frontal attack. After some time, the two armies face each other. Aisha and Hal use their magic to repel the soldiers, while Ki protects the princess from harm. Meanwhile, our protagonist watches carefully, observing the situation, but Carla notices how focused he is. Soma explains to her that he is responsible for everything that happens, and if they fail, he would have to sacrifice himself to save everyone else. This thought worries and frightens him, realizing that although he was only an interim king, he now holds many lives in his hands, and he doesn't feel entirely like a true king. On the other side, the king of Amadonia orders his son to flee the battlefield, as their soldiers are too exhausted to continue fighting. He wants his son to survive at the very least, knowing that if they retreat, Soma's army will pursue them wherever they go. The king commands his son to leave with some soldiers to preserve their family's legacy. His son initially refuses, but eventually agrees, leading the battlefield. The king then marches toward our protagonist, determined to reach him. At the same time, Soma's soldiers inform him that the king of Amadonia is heading their way. Soma reassures Carla by reassigning her slave collar to Lycia, asking her to stay with her. If something happens to him, he wants Lycia to take the throne. Carla resists, saying she cannot accept this order and suggests instead that she should face the king of Amadonia. Surprised by her words, Soma agrees and orders her to stop the king. Elsewhere, Soma's army leader knocks down a man on horseback, only to realize it was a decoy pretending to be the king. Meanwhile, Carla clashes swords with the real king of Amadonia, who overpowers her with his strength and pent-up rage. Just when things look dire, one of Soma's puppets intervenes and distracts the king. At that moment, Soma and his guards arrive. The enraged king points his sword at Soma and charges, but the puppet holds him back. Soma orders Carla to set the puppet on fire, which she does. The puppet bursts into flames and explodes. Soma rushes to check on Carla, making sure she's okay. Together, they watch as the badly injured king of Amadonia rises again, now barely wearing any armor. Slowly, with his rage intact, he marches forward, but a sudden volley of arrows strikes him down. With his final breath, the king throws his sword, which lands at Soma's feet. After a dramatic battle, the king collapses, and Soma declares victory, officially ending the war. Later, in the princess's chamber, she is informed that her father has died in battle. At first, she tries to brush it off, but eventually, she breaks down in tears, acknowledging her father's death. She excuses it by calling him an obsessed old fool for all his actions. The next day, Soma claims the Amadonia castle, and Lycia congratulates him, saying his strategy to defeat the king was a success with minimal casualties. Our protagonist explains that the strategy was inspired by a previous incident where monsters appeared on the border. During that time, Soma's group of adventurer scouts discovered Amadonian soldiers near the area. However, the monsters at the border were actually just puppets created by Soma to force both kingdoms to evacuate the area, ensuring there were no civilian casualties during the war. While they were discussing this, the leader of the army interrupted with a report, informing that the king's son had escaped during the battle along with several important ministers, but he noted that the princess was still present. Our protagonist ordered that bureaucrats be sent to neighboring kingdoms to inform them of what had transpired. Meanwhile, Pancho reported that the kingdom had plenty of food and other supplies, but the majority of their assets were in armaments. Soma decided that they would sell off the armaments and prioritize food, mentioning that if needed, they could send aid from their own kingdom to combat hunger. One of the generals then informed him that the army was highly motivated and could continue to conquer the entire kingdom, but Soma declined, explaining that advancing further could provoke the Chaos Empire, especially since they had invaded a region with an international treaty. He emphasized that they should avoid causing any further conflicts. However, he also shared his plan to win the trust of the people from the recently conquered city. To do this, he called upon Juna Doma, knowing that music could be a great mediator in these situations. A broadcast began, where they shared the latest updates about what had happened. Then, Soma and Aisha stepped forward to speak to the citizens, who were amazed to see someone so young had defeated their king. Soma began a series of songs, starting with a duet between a little girl and Juna. At the end of the program, Soma asked Aisha to stay close to protect him, as he had a surprise guest. The people, delighted by the performance, were even more excited when the minister and leader of Amadonia's defense took the stage to sing the national anthem. After the performance, the minister said she should end her own life, as she had just sung the anthem of a kingdom that no longer belonged to her. However, Soma responded by telling her that there was no reason for such a drastic action. In his kingdom, there were no laws forbidding the singing of songs from other countries. He expressed his ideal of creating a kingdom where everyone could be free alongside its inhabitants. And that wraps up today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of how a realist hero rebuilt the kingdom. If you love the twists, strategies, and Soma's leadership, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more anime content. Let me know in the comments which moments stood out the most for you, and don't forget to stay tuned for the next episode summary. See you in the next one.